In the cradle of civilization, between the two great rivers, the destiny of mankind was written in water and clay. For centuries, the land was divided, a patchwork of rival city-states, each bowing to its own king. Life was a cycle of sowing and reaping, dictated by the floods of the Tigris and the mercy of the heavens. Trade flowed between the cities, but trust was scarce, and borders were drawn in blood. The people looked upward for guidance, building mountains of mud to reach the gods who remained silent. War was the constant state of existence, a perpetual struggle for dominance that no single ruler could win. The priesthood held the power, interpreting the omens, keeping the kings in check with the fear of divine wrath.
But in the shadow of the throne of Kish, a commoner was watching, waiting, and learning the art of power.
Legends whisper of a cupbearer named Sargon, whose ambition would soon outgrow the walls of his master's palace. The winds of change were gathering, promising a storm that would sweep away the old order forever.
Sargon did not just seize a throne, he seized the imagination of the people, promising a unity never before seen.
Power was taken not by divine right, but by the sword and the will of a man who refused to be a servant.
He built a new capital, Akkad, a city not bound by ancient Sumerian traditions, but forged for a new era. For the first time, soldiers were not just farmers called to war, but professionals, fed and housed by the king. The old kings of Sumer resisted, but they faced a military machine that moved with a single, deadly purpose.
Conqueror of Uruk was brought to his knees, proving that the gods now favored a new master. City after city fell, until the land from the lower sea to the upper sea was united under one banner. He washed his weapons in the bitter waters of the Gulf, signaling that the conquest was complete. With conquest came a new identity, a shift in art and culture that celebrated the strength of the individual ruler. Akkad became the center of the world, a fortress of power, where the wealth of nations began to accumulate. To secure his rule, Sargon merged religion and state, appointing his daughter Enheduanna to bridge. The river wharves groaned under the weight of goods from Oman, the Indus Valley, and Anatolia. Chaos was replaced by order. A standardized system of weights allowed commerce to flourish across the empire. Communication became the sinew of the empire, with royal decrees reaching the farthest governors in days. He was no longer just a warrior. He was an administrator, managing the complexities of the first known empire.
But unity was fragile. The conquered cities simmered with resentment, requiring a constant iron hand.
The ambition of Akkad knew no natural borders, pushing northward into the mountains of silver and cedar. For a brief moment, the barriers of tribe and tongue seemed to dissolve within the walls of the capital. The great king grew old, knowing that he had built a colossus, but wondering if it could stand without him. Sargon passed into legend, leaving behind a throne that was now the most dangerous seat on earth. His sons inherited the crown, but also the rebellions, struggling to keep the empire from fracturing. Then came Naram-Sin, the grandson, who would push the empire to heights and depths never before imagined. He saw himself not merely as a servant of the gods, but as their equal, a king of the four quarters of the universe. He dared to wear the horned helmet of divinity, declaring himself a god of Akkad, while still walking the earth. The temples glittered with plunder, and the city of Akkad became a marvel of architectural prowess. Under his command, the army became an unstoppable force, penetrating deep into the barbarous lands of the east. He crushed the Lulubi and the mountain tribes, inscribing his victories on the very rocks of the mountains. The land was tamed, canals were dug, and the soil yielded surplus enough to feed the growing legions. Knowledge flourished alongside power. The heavens were mapped and the stars named. Art reached a level of realism and refinement that mirrored the confidence of the age.
The world came to Akkad from the distant Indus.
The bureaucracy was vast, a machine of governance that recorded every sheep, every bushel of grain, every silver ring. The empire seemed invulnerable, a fortress of civilization surrounded by a chaotic wilderness.
Law was administered in the king's name, binding the diverse peoples together under a single justice.
The dynasty projected an image of eternal stability, their lineage blessed by the stars. The fires of industry never slept, forging the tools of war that maintained the peace.
His image was everywhere, a reminder that the king's eye was always watching.
They built a paradise on earth, believing that the golden age would last forever.
He spoke to other kings not as a brother, but as a master, demanding submission. Wealth was the lifeblood of the empire, hoarded in the vaults of Akkad.
Victory was a daily ritual, celebrated with pomp and the parade of the vanquished.
Poets sang of his glory, weaving a narrative of invincibility that seduced even the king himself.
At its zenith, the shadow of Akkad covered the known world.
A generation was born knowing only the reality of the empire, unable to imagine a world without it.
But the higher the monument, the longer the shadow it casts. In the holy city of Nippur, the priests grew restless. They claimed the king had overstepped, offending the great god Enlil.
Later legends would tell of a king who sacked the house of Enlil, bringing down a divine curse upon his head.
The skies began to change. The rhythm of the seasons, once reliable, began to falter.
The water levels dropped. The life-giving veins of the empire began to run dry.
News arrived, Troy. Not of victory.
Old rivalries, long suppressed, flared up like embers in a dry forest.
The king of the four quarters found himself fighting fires that refused to be extinguished.
And from the mountains, eyes were watching. The Gushans, a people who knew no kings, were descending. The grand phalanx was useless against ghosts who struck from the hills and vanished into the mist.
In the markets, the price of grain soared. Silver lost its value when there was no bread to buy.
Fear crept into the capital. The walls that were meant to keep the world out now felt like a prison.
The successors inherited a crown that was too heavy. The structure was cracking under its own weight.
A great drought, a climatic shift spanning centuries, turned the fertile plains into dust bowls.
Hunger is a rebel that no army can defeat. The social contract was broken.
The orders stopped coming. The scribes put down their styluses. The bureaucrats ground to a halt.
They came down like a dragon from the mountain, the Gushians, those who did not know the rights of civilization. The cities fell one by one. The specialized army, unpaid and starving, dissolved into the night. Akkad, the jewel of the world, was put to the torch. The smoke of its burning was seen for miles.
The images of the god kings were smashed, their eyes gouged out so they could no longer watch over their land.
The people scattered like birds before a storm, leaving behind the hollow shells of their greatness. The barbarians sat on the throne, but they could not rule. They only knew how to take, not how to build. Wisdom gathered over generations was consumed by fire or buried under the rubble of ignorance. The canals choked with silt. The desert reclaimed the fields. The heartbeat of the empire stopped.
The gods had abandoned Akkad. Enlil's wrath, as foretold, had been absolute.
Anarchy descended. For years, the question was asked, who was king? Who was not king?
The streets where the world once traded were now silent graveyards.
Isolated attempts to restore order failed. The central spine of authority was shattered.
The stairway to heaven was broken. There was no longer a bridge between the earth and the sky.
The Golden Age became a distant memory, a story told by elders to starving children.
The earth itself seemed eager to bury the evidence of such hubris.
Final resistance faded. The sword of Sargon was rusted and broken. A dark age settled over the land, a time of chaos and regression.
The river flowed on, indifferent to the rise and fall of the men who claimed to own it. Enemies tried to erase the name, to wipe the memory of the empire from history. And so, the first empire fell, not with a whisper, but with a scream that echoed through the centuries. Centuries turned into millennia. The location of a god was lost, buried so deep that even today, it remains hidden.
But the memory could not be killed. Later kings of Babylon and Assyria would look back to Sargon as the ideal model.
They copied his legends, studied his tactics, and dreamed of his power.
The art of the empire, the realism and the majesty set the standard for all Mesopotamian culture that followed.
We dig in the sand today, finding fragments of their lives, the receipts, the prayers, and the decrees.
Copper head of a king stares back at us across 4,000 years, damaged but still radiating power.
The borders they drew are gone, but the concept remains. The dream of a unified land, of an empire.
They taught humanity that power could be centralized, that the world could be ruled as one.
They reached for the stars and fell back to earth, a warning and an inspiration to all who would follow. Before Rome, before Alexander, before the pharaohs united Egypt, there was Akkad, and history began there.